haven't yet felt this wonderfully euphoric feeling that many of the American people feel. You mentioned World War II. There was a definitive end to that conflict. And now we have Saddam Hussein still there.
He's sitting there with a frown on his face and saying to himself, why don't I feel better about this? In other words, he's signaling that, yeah, it was all great, it went right, but there's still something wrong, there's still something missing. I don't feel the same elation I felt when we had won World War II. And the reason, I think, is obvious, that it was an incomplete victory. It was a modest victory, snatched from the jaws of triumph, and Saddam Hussein was still in power.
Now another war began, the war to overthrow Saddam Hussein. In Iraqi cities in the south, close to the Allied front lines, Saddam's rule had collapsed. Ordinary people, mostly Shia Muslims, took up arms against a regime they hated. During the war, President Bush had called again and again for the Iraqis to overthrow Saddam.
And there's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein to step aside. We have no argument with the people of Iraq. Our differences are with that brutal dictator in Baghdad.
As the rebellions erupted, Bush repeated his call for Saddam's overthrow. In Basra, soldiers who had fled from Kuwait joined the rebels.
It wasn't organized opposition. People just rebelled against oppression, rebelled against cruelty and starvation, against the executions and detentions. There was injustice, and people in the streets rose up to overthrow this regime.
In the first heady days of the uprising, the rebels, not Iraqi officials, controlled the streets.
We did not think, the president nor any of us thought at that time that Saddam would continue in power, having suffered such a resounding defeat.
With victory won, the political concentration that had brought such success now seemed to desert the White House team. Washington left the details of the ceasefire for the generals to work out alone.
Norm Schwarzkopf said, how did we make this happen? What do we do? And we had a State Department representative in our war room, and he said to the State Department representative, what is it we're supposed to do, Mr. State Department rep? And the State Department rep gave what we call the Iraqi salute. He didn't know.
I had no instructions whatsoever, so lacking any, and based upon the conversations Cole and I had, I called my stenographer in and dictated my own terms of reference, and then I called up Cole and said, I'm going to send these to you, if you all approve, then send them back to me, and this is what I'll do.
The Pentagon changed happy to glad, we to they, and put in a few fixes, gave it to the State Department. The State Department changed a couple of words and sent it back to us and says, use this.
Schwarzkopf decided that the ceasefire talks would be held in coalition-occupied Iraq, near the town of Safwan. The Iraqi leadership wanted a deal that would return their captured territory and give them the freedom to crush the rebellions. Schwarzkopf's objectives were simpler.
I went to Safwan with my own instructions, which basically, number one, was to get our POWs back, and then number two, to make sure that we had very, very clear lines drawn so that we didn't have any inadvertent battles after that.
A pair of Apache gunships hovered over the approaching Iraqi convoy. Just hours before, Saddam had personally briefed the Iraqi generals arriving to meet Schwarzkopf.
Saddam wanted to consolidate the ceasefire in any way he could, and he ordered his officers to give any information they knew about the minefields and the prisoners of war. He didn't want to give the West any excuse to resume fighting. He wanted to sign a ceasefire agreement at any price.
Accompanied by the Saudi commander-in-chief, Schwarzkopf led the defeated Iraqi generals to the tent where the meeting would be held. Once the talks got underway, Schwarzkopf got everything he wanted. But so did the Iraqis.
What they were most concerned about was that this was going to be a permanent border. And over and over again, they kept saying, is this a permanent border or is this just temporary? And I kept having to reassure them that, no, this is not a permanent border. This is a temporary demarcation line between our forces. And then this fellow looked at me and said, well, can we fly our helicopters? And I knew the great devastation we had inflicted upon their roads and their bridges, and that seemed like a very reasonable request to me.
And then the Iraqis asked the question which should have given Schwarzkopf pause, and that was, well, how about armed helicopters? And Schwarzkopf, without even thinking, said yes, armed helicopters. Now, what the Iraqis had in mind were using their helicopter gunships to put down the Shia uprising which had taken place, and Schwarzkopf gave them carte blanche to do it. So he was finessed by the Iraqis at the Safwan conference.
The Iraqi generals got exactly what Saddam wanted, to the astonishment of some of the civilian architects of the war.
They should surrender their equipment, the lot. When you're dealing with a dictator, he has got not only to be defeated, well and truly, but he's got to be seen to be defeated by his own people, so that they identify the privations they've had to go through with his actions. And we didn't do that.
I think what we should have insisted upon is Saddam Hussein come to Safwan. That was our mistake, because that allowed him to blame his generals for the defeat and not he himself.
Saddam Hussein now moved forces loyal to him from Baghdad to suppress the uprisings in the south. American troops could see the fighting from their positions, but they were ordered not to intervene.
My advice to the president throughout the period of this uprising is that this did not seem to me to be an operation that we needed to get involved in, because I couldn't figure out who was doing what to whom. And it would have required us to move further into Iraq and take responsibility for that part of Iraq, and for a purpose that was not stated.
And that was the quagmire. Therein laid Vietnam as far as we were concerned, because we would still be there. And what's more, given the American way of doing things, we would have then had the responsibility for rebuilding all of the infrastructure. And we were just determined not to get sucked into that trap.
Inside Iraq, as each rebel village and town fell, there were terrible reprisals. These pictures, filmed by the Iraqis themselves, would not reach the West for 2 years. They show Shia prisoners and senior officers from the Iraqi regime. There are estimates that tens of thousands of Shias were killed.
The Americans did not interfere. Therefore, it took us only a few days to recover from the surprise, to reorganize our troops, reorganize our resources, and impose peace and order and the southern governors. It took us 2 weeks to do that.
Just a few miles away, 500,000 coalition troops began to leave Iraq. After months in the desert, they were returning home. The Allies still hoped one of Saddam's generals would overthrow him. But the ill-fated uprising had caused the Iraqi military to rally around Saddam out of fear of something worse. The White House had miscalculated. Meanwhile, the Iraqi leader had his part of the bargain to keep.
Round about March 3rd or 4th, this gray-haired gentleman opens up my cell door and says, "Do you need anything?" I said, well, at this point in time, I said, yes, I could use a couple blankets. I would like some shoes. I hadn't had any shoes. I was wearing yellow POW pajamas now that didn't fit, you know. So I started asking for stuff. I figured, I better ask now. I may not get anything ever again. No one's ever asked me if I needed anything. So I started asking for stuff, and he says, "Don't worry, you won't need any of that. You'll be leaving. You'll be going home in 15 minutes.
And around there were hundreds of reporters. And that's really quite overwhelming. I mean, you know, you've just been in solitary. And I think that's really when you thought, well, I probably am released. But I still didn't reckon I was not a prisoner of war until I was out of Iraq.
And then the pilot announces, you know, we're in Saudi Arabian airspace, and everybody starts shouting and you know, high-fiving each other, and a Brit tornado comes up and joins up and rocks his wings, and we can see the guy out the windows, and we're waving, and he's waving back at us, and it was just joyful.
And we landed in Riyadh, and I saw all these people, and I thought, my God, you know, what's this all about? As I started walking down the stairs, I realized that this really is for us. And my wingman was there to meet me, and he was overjoyed, obviously, to see me. I was overjoyed to see him. It's the first time that I had actually expressed any real emotion since being beaten.
I've spent very little of the war worried about whether or not I was female. It just didn't seem to matter. But I didn't want anyone to think that I was weaker or more emotionally vulnerable or anything like that when I got back. And I have to say that when they sing that song, I'm proud to be an American, I mean, I always well up. It's kind of like when they play taps or something. And so I played the song over my mind several times, and I even had, when we were coming back to the States to get the welcome back thing, I had somebody bring me a tape of it so I could listen to it and I could practice hearing it without crying.
And I won't forget the man who died, who gave that right to me, and I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love.
Did it work?
It worked, as a matter of fact. The only time I cried was when I saw my kid. I hadn't cried in months, but I remember seeing my kid and going over and hugging her, and that's when I lost it.
Trying to convince anybody what the realities of war are like is very difficult. Not just my situation. You know, if you've been shot at or in combat and seen friends die, you see it in the films, but you don't smell it, you don't hear it, and you don't see grown men cry, and you don't see what it's like to see real people hurt. And you can never put it in words when you return either.
Now there was a second uprising in Iraq, this time in the Kurdish north. Saddam had used chemical weapons to suppress previous revolts, but the Kurds sensed weakness. The secret police headquarters in Sulaymaniyah was one of the regime's nerve centers. For years, Kurdish guerrillas had fought for independence. Now they united with mutinous troops and attacked. The men inside resisted desperately. They knew there was much to avenge. As night fell, the gates were stormed. A Kurdish teenager educated in Britain was there. He'd heard President Bush on the radio.
When George Bush said that he would back up a people's revolution in Iraq, then they thought, that's all we need. That's all we wanted to hear, so they just did it.
In the south, the uprisings had been incoherent, but the Kurdish uprising was different. The Kurds had political leaders who could give the revolt shape. As the rebellion gathered momentum, these Kurdish leaders who'd been living abroad began to return. They wanted to trigger a coup against Saddam. They hoped a new Iraqi leader would let the Kurds run their own affairs. Traveling with them was an American, an observer from the United States Senate.
At that point, everything hung in the balance. Had the United States signaled its support for the uprising, I am convinced it would have succeeded. There were Iraqi generals who were, in fact, in touch with the opposition and who were sitting on the fence waiting to see what would happen. And when the United States did nothing, said nothing, sat on its hands, of course, they took the course of caution.
That very night, Saddam Hussein's troops attacked. Washington had decided it did not want to support an uprising that might lead to the breakup of Iraq. The rebel forces fought back, but they were hopelessly outgunned. The Kurdish leaders who'd encouraged the revolt had made a terrible miscalculation. As shells began landing on the cities, there was panic. Not only were the casualties heavy, but they feared a chemical attack at any moment.
I do not want to push American forces beyond our mandate. And we've done the heavy lifting. Our kids perform with superior courage, and they don't need to be thrust into a war that's been going on for years.
The Iraqi forces advanced relentlessly, and the cities of Kurdistan emptied before them. Now, 1 million people were on the move. They headed for the mountains, trying to reach the safety of the Turkish and Iranian borders.
When George Bush said that he didn't want the American military interfering in this, the Kurds got scared. We heard the shelling and the bombing, and our next door neighbor came around and he said, look, you've heard what people are saying about the Iraqis. I think it'd be, wise of us just to leave Sulaimania. So my dad agreed and said, okay, we'll leave.
It reminded me of refugees leaving Paris in June 1940, just ahead of the German army. Everybody knew of George Bush's call for them to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein, and they all had exactly one question: why isn't Bush helping us?
The American pilots patrolling the skies above Iraq could see the Kurds being chased into the mountains, but they had strict orders not to intervene.
We saw helicopters chasing a lot of people down a road, and we saw the gunships shooting at them. You could see the smoke coming out of the gunship and occasionally see flashes of the tracers, even though the sun had just started coming up.
Saddam Hussein bombing, bomba, helicopters destroyed us. I don't know. They saw this, but they don't know why. We are human like you.
We felt frustrated in the fact that we couldn't help the uprising that was going on the ground for whatever political reasons that were above our rank. And the best we could do is report what we saw and eventually hope that it was taken care of.